This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin, and with me this week, two stupendous human beings, Nick White.
Hey.
And Kait Lamphere.
Hi.
Thank you both for joining me this week. I'm so excited to be here to talk about comic books with you. It's been a lot of weird times lately, to say the least, and quite honestly, I'm glad to be back to kind of normal on our show. In a weird way, this is the first week we're going to start talking about comic books again in terms of new comics that are coming out. So get hyped because new comics are coming out. They did come out last week. I just didn't realize that. So sorry about that, folks who were screaming into their iPhones or whatever Android devices or at their computer. That
Microsoft
new comic
Zoom
books came out. What the fuck? Yeah, if you've got a Microsoft Zoom and you're listening to the show, reach out to us. I want to buy that Zoom off of you. But anyways, I've got a question that I want to ask that I ask every single week on the show, which is, how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kait.
I've been good. I have been attempting to grow plants on my porch in pots, and I almost killed them twice, but they're fine right now.
Nice.
So I have been reading quite a bit of Hoopla comics, as I'm sure everybody has been. The latest thing that I've read was Emma and Violette, A Dream for Three. This is by Jerome Heeman, and it's a short French series. It's really cute. So I used to dance when I was a kid, which kind of turned me on to reading this comic. And there's more than one volume on there, but the volumes themselves are very short. Like, they're more like our American issues sizes, like 60 pages, 70 pages. And the plot is that Emma is the older daughter, and then Violette is her younger sister, and then there's their mom, and that's the three people, which I didn't quite get until about the end of the book. I was like, why are they talking about three people in this subtitle? And Emma and Violette are trying to get into this prestigious dance school, but you slowly learn through the book that Emma really isn't that into dance, but she's practicing like 5 hours a day for some reason. And Violette mostly just wants to follow her sister into school, but she turns out that she actually individually does like all this dance stuff. And then the mom is the wild factor in here. And it turns out that when she was a kid, she was really trying super hard to get into a prestigious school or an orchestra or something. Mm-hmm. And she didn't make it in as a violinist. So she's been like, my girls, if they want to do this, they have to really be in it. And, Emma's like, but mom, but I don't want to. So I won't spoil how the comic book ends. And then, of course, there's more that I haven't read. But it is very cute. So if you like French comics, if you like cute stories, if you like dance, I highly recommend it.
Very cool. Very cool. This sounds like a really dramatic series. So I don't know how cute it is. Like you're saying, oh, it's really cute. It's really French. It sounds like
the
a very dramatic series.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it might be written for kids. Like the two girls are probably, the oldest one is maybe like 12 or 13. Mm-hmm. And then the youngest one's probably under 10. So I think that it's probably written for about that age group. So the art is very cute. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as an adult, I can totally see where the mother is coming from. And then having been in dance, I know how hard it would be to actually get into like a real dance school. As opposed to my 1 hour class a week that I did.
Gotcha.
So like I kind of came at it from this more like informed perspective about like the bigger world that the creator was probably speaking from, but the actual story itself is pretty simple and adorable.
Gotcha. Well, I will. I'll take a look at that. I did look it up while you were talking, I should say, and the art is very, very pretty. I mean, it's a very good looking book. But it sounds very heavy. But, I'll take your word for it that it's not as heavy as my mind is making it out to be. What about you, Nick? How have you been? How have comic books been?
Things have been good. We're reaching that point of the year where I think people want to go outside and do things. And to those people, just stop it. Knock it off. Like, I'm just trying to go outside and walk around my block, and I just this isn't too much to ask, okay? The few times that I choose to go outside, everybody else, stay inside.
Dear world.
I'm not asking too much, I don't think. But when I see anyone else outside, I get anxious. So just don't do it. Just don't do it. Nick, how will we do that? How will we coordinate this? I understand that is a concern. I think I'm going to get on Nextdoor. Is that the app? Nextdoor?
Yeah.
Where you like report all your neighbors when their dog isn't on a leash or whatever. That's Nextdoor, right? So I will get on there. I will block out my walking times, and during those periods, I don't want to see your fucking face. Okay. Like,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow, Nick.
Yeah. Things are going great. I'm handling all of this perfectly fine. That's what I tell myself. I don't ask for outside opinions on that issue because I don't want to hear them. Let's talk about comics. I feel like I have some element of control in my life when it comes to that. In terms of things I've read, I've got a few little brief things, and then I'll get into a larger work here, one that I'm sure will piss Mike off, so I'm really eager about that. I read Drawing the Vote, an illustrated guide to voting in America, written by Tommy Jenkins, illustrations by Katie Lacker. This is published by Abrams Comic Arts, which is an imprint of Abrams, surprisingly. Jenkins is a professor of creative writing and American literature at Lewisburg College in North Carolina. He basically points out at the beginning of the book that he felt his students were very excited and up for participating in the election process in 2008, which of course was the first time that President Obama was elected. And then points out how much people were largely, his students were largely apathetic about the voting process in 2016. So he wrote this book because, quote, learning the history of voting is to learn the history of political and ideological struggles in America and the dramatic changes that shaped the country as we know it today. Yeah, it's a pretty weighty book. It goes through a lot of different things, including how the Electoral College came about because there were fears that uninformed voters should not be able to, or rather the fear of having uninformed voters voting on such important processes, to Reconstruction. Very weighty book. I was kind of half awake when reading it, and a lot of it was kind of depressing, so I don't have anything more to say on it, but if you want something informative and interesting and different, I would recommend that book. I also read Lone Wolf and Cub, Volume 7, Cloud Dragon, Wind Tiger. That's by Kazuo Koike, who wrote it, and Goseki Kojima, who illustrated it. The bad guys finally decide that they're going to round up Lone Wolf as part of and I'm definitely going to botch this, a Desa Goyo, which is a policy, I assume it was real and was a thing, where vagrants would be rounded up around Japan and be forced to work in the gold mines or labor camps. Unsurprisingly, Lone Wolf, or Ogami Ito, he isn't real interested in working for people for free or being told what to do.
Nick, what is he interested in doing instead?
Blunt force trauma.
Curious. Right. Okay. That's what I was wondering.
And sometimes not blunt force trauma. Slightly sharper than blunt force trauma.
Right.
In this book, this chapter, rather this volume, which consists of several chapters, kind of reminded me of another one of these chapters' patterns, which is that a lot of them begin in media res with Daigoro, that's his son, Cub, already just being abandoned. Like the chapter just begins and Daigoro's all by himself. He's like 3 at the point I'm at in the book. And okay. You're like, and if you're thinking that's pretty bad, oh, it's worse. Like he was getting abandoned at like 2, I'm pretty sure, in earlier volumes. And he's just all by himself. And this one begins with him just balancing on logs in the middle of a river, like a lumberjack. And so basically a lot of these chapters more or less have the same opening conceit, which is, hey, where's my dad? So basically usually what happens is Daigoro gets into trouble. Some people try to like arrest him or again, he's like a baby, right? They like try to, capture him or use him as a bargaining chip. And then they go, oh, he has warrior's eyes, basically. And they get kind of scared. And that usually keeps the people that are going to endanger him from leaving him alone long enough for his dad to come back and then murder everybody. So
I see. Okay.
I love this book. Like, there are so many like recurring patterns and narrative tropes like this that just keep showing themselves over and over again. It's a lot of fun. But then I do want to briefly say I did read Berserker Unbound by Jeff Lemire, art by Mike Deodato Jr., colors by Frank Martin, letters by Steve Wand. I don't need to say much here about Lemire. Everybody knows Lemire. Deodato's done a lot of Marvel work. Martin's colored a lot of Deodato's Marvel work, etc., etc. Basically, I know Mike isn't real keen on this book. I mean, the conceit is pretty simple. You have this guy called the Mongrel King. He's this warrior Conan-esque character who kills everything, and he just so happens to be returning home at the beginning of the book. And I just have to say this, okay? This is a public service announcement, all right? Friends and family of adventurers and warriors abroad, don't let your family members come home. It won't end well for you. Okay?
Oh, no.
It's not going to work out. Like, remember, Luke only played hooky for an afternoon, and his aunt and uncle turned into charcoal briquettes. Okay?
Oh, no, Nick.
If your husband or dad or grandpa is out journeying around the world, and they send you a postcard, and it says, "I'm coming home," write one back that says, "Don't you dare."
Wait. What about daughters and mothers and grandmothers?
Right. I was specifically referring to the specific situation within this text, but yes, obviously this is not completely restricted to husbands and grandpas and fathers. That's just the specific scenario for this book. Don't try to get me in trouble with people here, Michael.
Aunts and uncles are fine. I just want to narrow down the specifics here. That's all that I'm wondering.
That's fair. But yeah, this book obviously starts with that very like gladiator / God of War trope of, honey, I'm home, everyone's dead. There's some very ornate and detailed battle sequences in this book, which is clearly Deodato's strength, and Lemire is letting him play to that strength. I think the issue is I'm not so sure Lemire is comfortable writing for a book that's more splash page than sequential art driven. And you can even see this in the way that Lemire tries to impose these like artificial panel segmentations with these like white borders that just like he'll have these like white borders that slash through the middle of what would normally be like a splash page panel, and he's just drawn some lines through the middle of it, and it's like,
well, we don't know if that's Deodato or if that's Lemire though. That's that's a whole probably a team decision is my guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, someone decided on it, and that person made a bad decision. Okay,
sure. I just don't want to point fingers where they don't need to be pointed completely.
That's fair. So I don't really like that. I'm not a huge fan. I think that overall, to just get at the core of this real briefly, I think issues 3 and 4 are a lot stronger. They do kind of reach a point of ultimately becoming a talking fueled book that's more about sadness and kind of being able to lean on one another in a time of sadness in order to carve out a new future for ourselves. And I think the potential for volume 2 of this book is strong. I think the real problem is it's so hard to sell people on, not even like the first issue is slow to launch, but like the first volume is slow to launch. And whether or not you can ask people to get on board with that, and even more so, whether or not you should sort of promote works that kind of have this philosophy, I don't know. I sometimes wonder if Lemire is finally starting to reach that point where he's spreading himself a little bit thin, and maybe certain projects are just either not going to be revisited or they're going to be revisited quite a while down the line.
Right. Well, to me, this felt like a book that was like, hey, we all happen to have some time. Let's put together this 4-issue miniseries, right? Or how? Yeah, 4 issues, 5 issues,
That's
4
correct.
issues,
4. Yeah.
And if they do a volume 2, I'd be real curious to see what they do that doesn't make this book just a Conan book, because I think it's funny that this book launched, right after the Conan license was moved back over to Marvel. So it's funny to think, okay, Dark Horse, are they going to keep publishing a book that's more or less a blatant ripoff of a pretty well-known character? Or is Lemire going to, twist this very, very hard like he did with all of the Black Hammer stuff to make it so unique on its own that you couldn't really say that these are the same book? They have similar characteristics, but they are by and large not the same book.
Yeah, and I think that's made even more ironic by the fact that Lemire, Deodato, and Martin all met working together on a Marvel book, the Thanos miniseries. Right. And so for them to sort of meet up and say, hey, let's do Conan, just as Marvel gets the Conan license. And then they're like, yeah, let's do Conan. Let's just not do it here. And then they go off and go do it at Dark Horse. Dark Horse of all places. Yeah, that is kind of funny. So, yeah, those are a couple of the different books I read. Maybe you're not as angry about Berserker Unbound, considering that I wasn't totally sold on it either, but I think you maybe were not as, or were slightly more upset with it than I was.
Yeah, I had a big long rant on the Discord yesterday when we were talking after the book club about this. I don't necessarily want to go into it again because
you can give me like the 30 seconds.
But the 30-second pitch is, this is a book that I feel like could have been either done as a one-shot or could, like, an oversized one-shot, like 64 pages or something. Or it was a book that kind of felt like it had no purpose, right? It's telling a story about, sure, like a sad thing, but like, what are we actually exploring?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are we, like, Lemire in his whole team, like, they are brilliant creators. It's kind of a question of like, what actually are they trying to say in this book? And I didn't get anything out of it other than Strong Boy sad. Like, that's it. Is that the fucking story? Like, I don't really think so. And I know that there's a parallel story in the book of the guy that he meets in the forest, and they can't understand each other until later in the book when they can. Like, I get that there's kind of a parallel there that's supposed to be driven, but it didn't feel strong. It felt like weirdly too convenient. Like, I think this is a problem with 4-issue miniseries sometimes, that which is funny that I say that now, because when we talk about Firefly later, I have a completely different thought about 3-issue miniseries. But the problem with 4-issue miniseries is that there seems to be the buildup that you would expect to be played out over 6 issues, but then it gets cut short in the end. And I feel like that's exactly what happened. Tons of buildup, really quick wrap up, and therefore the book felt hollow to me. Maybe a second read through will change my mind on that, but I didn't feel strongly about it. I was kind of disappointed in the end of it, because if there's going to be a volume 2, I literally don't know what else they're going to do other than have more like Conan shit to explore. Or does this guy come back to the to the real world and do something else? Like, does he get a job working at a fucking newspaper or something? Like, I don't know. So I'm a little weirdly salty about a book that was so beautiful, and to me felt like it had a lot of promise, and ultimately it felt like it fell flat for me. So but anyways, if you want to hear more rants and raves about this that are in a longer form, jump on the Discord, because I get real salty sometimes, especially after I've had baseball whiskey. But for me, really quick, this past week's been pretty all right. Got some things scheduled in the mix that are coming up that I'm pretty excited about for the show. So more on that probably in June's schedule update. If you're on Patreon, that's a thing. But beyond that, I've mostly just been reading a lot of One Piece, but I did sit down and read some other stuff. I read The Way of the Househusband Volume 3. This is a manga that's coming out from Viz. It's one of the goofiest, almost strip style comic. It's a manga. It's like 11 to 12 pages per chapter, and this is by Kuosuke Ono, and the story is a former Yakuza like assassin or like heavy hitter decides to one day get married to an office woman who has a full-time job, and so he stays at home all the time, and he cooks and he cleans and he does all this stuff. But it's hilarious because he's this weird, and I don't want to say weird, he's this tattooed gangster looking guy who still dresses like a tattooed gangster in, like, big suit, or what are they called, like tracksuits and stuff, and he's got the glasses and chains and stuff. But all of his quote unquote enemies that he's trying to kill and take out are like a roach in the house, or the microwave that's acting up, or a toaster oven that's brand new. And it's like it's hilarious. And each chapter, just when you think the joke has been stretched too thin, it ends, and it's perfectly timed. The first, I think, volume 2, I have not laughed so hard at a comic in many, many years. Just some of the bits in that are fantastic. One of his former lackeys ends up wanting to learn from him, because they're like, oh, he must be training for something great if he's, given up his whole life to go do this thing. It must be super important because he's like the baddest ass dude ever. He's like the John Wick of the Yakuza. Essentially, that's how people treat him. So as the story goes on, he runs into other gangsters and stuff. And this book is drawn as if it was a serious, like, adult comic, but instead it's just this goofy story where this guy has to, he's helping his wife do things around the house, or he's doing all the things around the house, and his wife comes home and she's tired. And it's really, really funny. Volume 3 is a continuation of it. It's like 12 chapters per volume. It's probably one of the funniest manga I've read in a very long time. So I highly recommend it if you just want some goofs, because the art is stupendous. It's drawn so serious, and then it turns, the camera will turn around and it'll be like, oh, has to deal with a 7-year-old kid who's trying to sell him cookies, rather than actually a person who's come to his house to murder him. It's written so well. Like every joke opens up the same. It's very serious until you realize what the actual thing that's happening is revealed. So highly recommend that. The other book that I read was the Ludocrats #1. Like I said, I realized that comic books really did come out last week, but we didn't talk about them. So the book that I would have picked anyways would have been Ludocrats #1. This is Jim Rossignol with Kieran Gillen, art by Jeff Stokely and Tamara Bonvillain. And yeah, this is the wild and crazy book that I think people have been looking forward to for a while. Kieran Gillen has been apparently planning on releasing this book for many, many years. He's been working with Jim to make it actually happen. And I think Jeff Stokely and Tamara Bonvillain came in and made this book the wildest and craziest thing ever. Really looking forward to #2, because #1 barely made a lick of sense. But I think that's because between Jim and Kieran, they're trying to be a little bit more unhinged than I think. At least I'm not too familiar with Jim's work, but I know Kieran Gillen's work. He's not nearly that unhinged compared to someone like a Grant Morrison or a Warren Ellis or an Alan Moore or whatever, these British writers that tend to go off the fucking deep end with wild shit and then somehow manage to wrap it up for good or for bad. But I think that with this series, with Ludocrats, Kieran Gillen is really trying to be a little bit more wild and crazy, and it's very, very clear that's what they're going with, at least in the first issue. So I'm excited to read more. I'm sure there's some meta commentary that I'm not smart enough to understand in this book, but for what it is, for what I read, I thought it was pretty fun and entertaining. It'll be interesting to see where it goes, because the whole goal of the book is you must be ludicrous, you must be wild, you must be not trying too hard, but be insane. And I think that's a pretty fun concept to run with, because it allows for cartoony antics at the same time as people having serious problems and discussions. A lot of sex is involved, a lot of just asinine things happen throughout. So I'm excited to see how wild and crazy this book gets. But anyways, let's talk about comic books that are coming out in the upcoming week. Feels good to say that phrase. Comic books are dropping on May 27th, 2020. What are you both excited for this week? I'm going to kick it back to you, Nick.
So for me, we're going to talk about Jeff Lemire again. I know, that's shocking. Gasp. So the first volume of Family Tree comes out. This is a series from Image, written by Jeff Lemire, art by Phil Hester, inks by Eric Gapster, colors by Ryan Cody, letters by Steve Wands. The premise is as follows, quote, when an 8-year-old girl begins to transform into a tree, her single mom, troubled brother, and possibly insane grandfather embark on a bizarre and heart-wrenching odyssey across the backroads of America, desperately searching for a way to curse... Jesus, that's not it. Not curse. Desperately searching for a way to cure her horrifying transformation before it's too late. So it feels a lot like Sweet Tooth, honestly.
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds a lot like Sweet Tooth, but it's more about a kid, I guess.
Well, he was kind of a kid in Sweet Tooth.
Well, I guess he was. Sorry, I should say it's more like Sweet Tooth was about the kid. This was more about the family.
Sure. Yeah, so it's a lot of Lemire's strong points. Family stories about rural / farming / small town living, some horror elements in there. So I feel like it's a lot of what we've kind of come to expect from him. But also, again, as I said, it does seem to harken back to Sweet Tooth more than anything else, which I think is arguably, I was going to say, the first title that put him on the map, although maybe that was Essex County. Who knows? I should know. That's the correct answer. So yeah, I think pairing up with Hester was a smart choice. Hester's actually no slouch of an author himself. I read his series Mythic, which he wrote for Image a few years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. Lemire describes the book in an interview with Sci-Fi as a work that, quote, combines all of my storytelling obsessions into a love letter to David Lynch and Alan Moore, all filtered through Phil Hester's incredible vision and a sprawling new horror mythology set against a family road trip across America in the 1990s, which it's like, geez, like, hedge your bets, like, maybe don't set people up for things, like, maybe it should be like, hey, this is a book, you might like it, it's possible you won't. This is also why I'm not doing marketing for Image Comics, I suppose. But yeah, I would encourage people to check out some of the preview art. I think Hester's art might be a little kind of 90s loose aesthetic for some people. I think it works for this book. I think it's a good pairing for this title. But yeah, I'm sure some people will kind of say, I don't know if this is for me. But I'm pretty on board. I didn't hear much when it was coming out in single issues, but I think also some of those single issues were starting to drop as things were getting a little bit wild around the world, and so there wasn't, I think, as much attention there. So yeah, I'm very excited to read this as a collected volume. So
I remember seeing this and thinking, oh, I'll pick up the collection. I had no idea when it was coming out. I just really quick before I pass over to Kate, I do have a small story about Phil Hester. I was really, really obsessed with his book Fire Breather that he did over at Image. Short-lived series. It kind of lived in the shared, quote-unquote, shared universe that Image was creating for a little bit, that was kind of set up between Invincible, Astounding Wolfman, Tech Jacket, Spawn was in there, Savage Dragon. They all did a big crossover at one point, and Fire Breather was another character that I really liked, and I was obsessed with the book. And so I had brought all the single issues that I had to a C2E2, or no, this was before Fire Breather came out. It had been announced, but I saw Phil Hester. I had read some other stuff that he had done. I had brought some issues with me that I wanted to get signed from him. This is at C2E2, maybe like the first or second year, and I had a sketchbook full of Gambits that I was trying to get, and I was poor and I didn't have any money, so I was thinking, I'll just maybe walk over and ask if people will do free sketches. And so I brought these books up to Phil Hester, and I had him saying, oh man, I really love this stuff, I really love everything you're doing. And I was like, hey, I know that you also draw, would you be up for drawing like a Gambit in my book? And he looked at me and he looked down at all my books and he said, sure, kid, hold on a second. Like, he was not pleased that I had asked him, but he pulled out a permanent marker and he drew this beautiful sketch. Like, it took him 10 minutes. He drew this beautiful Gambit in my sketchbook that I have around my house somewhere. But I will always treasure that because I know, like, since then, I always pay for commissions and sketches. I have the money to do so, and I always feel bad about it, asking for anything for free. But at the time, I was just like, I just want to get some sketches, and there were some webcomic artists who were all for it, and they were doing it. So I didn't know who was who really. I didn't know if this was a regular thing or not. And I asked him, and he was very nice about it. But yeah, that's my one Phil Hester story. And one day I want to get like a really nice commission from him because his art is fucking incredible. But he was kind enough to give me a free sketch that I will always treasure. So anyways, Kate, what about you? What are you excited for this upcoming week?
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot to pick from, so I was like looking for like some Lady Mechanica or something to get really jazzed about. But I don't think everybody's quite ramped up that much. So, yeah. But I did find something that I think does look very cute and is right down my alley. It's called Steam Volume 1. It's by Drew Ford, Dwayne Leslie, and Eva De La Cruz. And I'm not super sure when this is coming out. So if you look for it this week and you don't find it, try again next week. I've seen like 4 different release dates across different websites for it. So maybe it depends on if it's ebook versus library versus physical. I have no idea. Anyway.
True, yeah.
So
we're in weird times right now. It's okay.
Yeah, it's all right. This book is about young Arlo who escapes his abusive guardians on Earth, and he goes through a steam-powered planet through some kind of portal, and this planet is called Pother, and he learns that his long-lost dad helped a corporation on Earth steal resources from Pother, maybe on accident. And in order to set things right, Arlo joins a resistance force to try to rid the planet of this corporation and to protect its indigenous beings. Along the way, of course, he has to learn some things about himself. The cover art is very cute, and this whole like sci-fi coming of age story that is also like protecting indigenous beings on this new planet. I don't know, it's just it all has, it's got all these ingredients to it that makes it really sound like something I'd enjoy. And I really like steampunk, and this has some kind of steampunk influence. I'm not really clear. It's geared toward young audiences, so I imagine it'll mostly just be a fun ride all around.
I was gonna say, this thing definitely is just, I would see this on a shelf and I would go, that's for Kate.
Yeah.
Yep, Kate's gonna buy that.
Well, I said I was looking for some Lady Mechanica, which is a little bit steampunky, and then I found this, and I was like, this sounds good.
Yeah, dude, I looked up the preview for this while we were sitting here, and I was just like, oh yeah, this is this is definitely your thing. Not to say that's a bad thing at all, but I'm glad that you found something that will hit that sweet spot for you. For me, I am excited for Outer Darkness / Chew #2. This is John Layman with art by Afu Chan and Rob Gilroy. Because why not? I love this book. I love Chew. I love Outer Darkness. I know that there is some strangeness when it comes to these books. Some people really don't like them. Some people really, really do. But I love them. I'm one of those people. And the first issue of this book was wild. It's kind of felt like a what if series. And I think that's what this is. I'm really just rolling with it. Like, Layman knows his characters very well. And as a fan of both Chew and Outer Darkness, I'm really excited for both of these books to kind of come together. As I said, it's really funny to see Afu Chan drawing Jack Colby and Tony Chu. I honestly think it's very hilarious because his style is so drastically different than Rob Gilroy's almost, like cartoon style that he does, that looks like something that would be on Nickelodeon in the late 90s, early 2000s, compared to Afu Chan, who has this very like modern pastel, like it's still cartoony in a lot of ways, but it feels more modern in style. And to see those two styles side by side is very, very fun. Because Rob Gilroy does a handful of pages in the chapter in the issue, and but Afu Chan does the majority of the book. And the mystery that they're solving that requires Tony Chu to show up is very goofy. And the thing that I really enjoy about this is it's kind of reminding me that Chu and Outer Darkness are not books to really be taken too seriously. And I think Layman is using this book as a reminder to say, hey, we can do some goofy stuff while telling a really compelling story. And here's proof. I'm going to tell you a really compelling story with the wild elements of Chew somehow scattered into the fucking crazy, weird sci-fi fantasy mix story that I have that is Outer Darkness. So very excited to see what #2 does. I think this is a 3-issue miniseries. So I hope that Layman has the chops to wrap it all up. But yeah, so if you're a fan, let me know. I want to hear what other people have to say about this series. And with that, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about one of the biggest, greatest sci-fi series ever made, Firefly.
Star Wars.
Wait a second. We will be back. We'll be back in just a quick second. For our show this week, we are talking about the infamous, the one and only television series of great sci-fi renown, Firefly, that originally aired on television in the year 2002 and 2003. But we're not just going to be talking about the TV show. No, in fact, we're talking about the comic books based on this TV show. I think in a previous episode of our show, we did talk about comic books that allowed television shows to live on and movies to live on. But today in specific, we are talking about Firefly because people love this show to death. And I realize it's probably not as popular as Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever, but nonetheless, I feel like for the current generation of folks, people that have been watching TV and consuming comic books and all these different things and have been to comic book conventions, Firefly's had a pretty decent presence for almost 20 years now. I'm looking at this number as to when it aired. I cannot believe it that it came out in 2002 to 2003 because I didn't hear about it until like 2007. So I'm just baffled. So I brought together on this episode 2 experts on the series, people that know maybe quite a bit about it, or at least watch the TV show and have some thoughts on it. And we're going to talk about the TV show as well as the comics that are based off of the TV show, because they're still coming out to this day. Boom Studios is still producing a Firefly comic because it still has that much of a pull. So Kait, Nick, I want to know what your thoughts are. I guess I'm going to toss this to Kait really quick because, Kait, this was originally your idea. You wanted to talk about the Firefly comics. No, I want to know why. Why did you make us do this today?
Well, thanks for doing this with me, first of all. If we have any listeners out there that aren't familiar with Firefly but are still listening, thank you. And I just wanted to summarize Firefly really quickly. The IMDb summary is 500 years in the future, a renegade crew aboard a small spacecraft tries to survive as they travel the unknown parts of the galaxy and evade warring factions as well as the authority agents out to get them. And a lot of people describe this as a Western in space just because there's kind of like this tone of like this backwater country, outer rim of planets that is embraced by the used to be rancher spaceship captain Mal. So, and then there was a crowdsourced movie in September 2005, which was before crowdsourcing was really like a thing on the internet that happened a lot. So good job, fans from back then. I didn't even know about that this was a thing back then. So thank you.
Yeah, I thought that movie just came out. That's surprising. I didn't know that either.
And then the comics were originally published by Dark Horse, written by Joss Whedon, the same writer of the show and the movie. And those comics started being released in July 2005, right before the movie came out. And there were a whole lot of breaks in that original run of the comics. There were 5 volumes, and the last volume was released in 2017. So that shows you how big of a break there was between them. Years and years. And then the Boom comics that have mostly been written by Greg Pak and are still ongoing were released in November 2018. So that kind of gives you some backstory about this franchise.
I mean, and for this episode, to try to pare things down a little bit, Kait, you picked 2 books that you wanted us to dig into. We wanted to read some of the old stuff, some of the new stuff. So we read the first arc, or at least I read most of Firefly Book 1 with writers Joss Whedon, Zach Whedon, Patton Oswalt, Brett Matthews, Jim Krieger, with art by a handful of different people, Will Conrad, Chris Samney, Patrick Reynolds, Fabio Moon. But we focus specifically on the first 3-issue volume, Serenity, Those Left Behind. This was by Joss Whedon and Brett Matthews with art by Will Conrad. And then we also read Greg Pak's Firefly Volume 1, The Unification War, with art by Dan McDade, colors by Marcelo Costa, letters by Jim Campbell, and cover art by Lee Garbett. Yeah,
so that gave you guys some Dark Horse and some Boom experience with Firefly, which I think are really different.
Drastically different.
Yeah.
Kait, I have so many thoughts about comparing these 2 books, but continue.
You asked me why I wanted to read Firefly, why I'm so into Firefly, and I every time that I watch this show, I pick up more in it. Like, for example, I've watched this show a dozen times. I rewatched the show in preparation to read the books. And this last time through, I realized that we see the gruff, basically security guy, Jane. We see him forging IDs in one of the episodes, which, like, you would never think that this man would be able to forge official documentation. And this is the first time I ever picked it up. So, like, there's just so much. These stories are so rich. It's a large group of characters, which Joss Whedon is historically good at writing, and they all have their own individual relationships with one another. They're their own standalone character that is interesting, and then there's a whole group dynamic, and then they're all brought together by this captain Mel. and he's kind of the glue that holds them together. But then, I mean, especially with these comics, you do see them in smaller groups, talking to one another and realizing that they are a family, even when Mal's not there. And then the world building is phenomenal. I mean, you have the inner rim, which is controlled by the Alliance, and the outer rim, which is there is some correspondence with, that's where the Resistance is hiding, but there's not like a one-for-one correspondence with, like, a lot of the outer rim is still pro-Alliance because it brings them resources and helps terraform the planets, all of that good stuff with having basically corporate backing, effectively. And then you also have some nefarious, more science fiction things, like there are Reavers, which are kind of like madmen that basically just roam around and murder people. And then you have these assassin girls, and one of them is one of the main characters, River. They're basically, they've had a lot of surgeries and a lot of kind of like brainwashing training to just be controllable assassins for the Alliance. So there's just so much. It's so good.
Yeah, and I mean, I think when this came out, I mean, this was riding on the coattails of Buffy having just finished, I think. And the series was, it's been heavily impactful. I think lots of folks who were in like nerd circles, there's always going to be the one Firefly person who still sticks to their guns and is still, toting the series. So Kate, I'm sorry, but you're that person in the circle today. And we love you for it. Like, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are some, things we have to acknowledge. Joss Whedon is kind of in like a weird, problematic place. So I think some of the praising of his creation is not necessarily a praise of him. I just want to get that out of the way.
Yeah, for sure.
At least in my part. But beyond that, I mean, the Firefly series is really interesting because, to me at least, because it's kind of like a weird commentary on like the parts of Star Trek that you probably don't see. Where if you're thinking about some of the Star Trek stuff being like the Alliance going out and trying to, group together. I have like a whole thing about that, but I guess, Nick, I want to ask, what's your background in Firefly when it comes to like the show and the comics?
Well, I don't know anything about this, and I don't know why I was brought. No, I'm just kidding.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah, good news. I think there was a staffing error for this episode. No. So my experience with Firefly is kind of a curious one, and I don't think it matches up with most people's. And by that, what I mean is that, and as much as I want to roll my eyes into the back of my head and hope that they never return when I hear other people say this, I actually watched this when it was on TV.
And you still kept watching it because I heard that Fox really fucked things up.
Well, I mean, first off, it was definitely a testament to Fox having not burned me as many times as they eventually would over the years.
Sure.
So, I mean, they killed Lone Gunman, which was my X-Files spinoff, which I really loved. And I think that sort of gave me a little bit of a foreshadowing for Firefly. But that said, I mean, if anything else, Firefly is a great testament to just exactly how much I was living it up in 10th grade on Friday nights. Where are you at? Do you know where your kid is? Yeah, he's watching Firefly. He's a real loser. No, I'm just kidding. So I was watching Firefly on Friday nights, which also tells you just how much Fox thought of the show, that they were going to put it in the death slot, 8 p.m. Friday nights. It's where it's the television programming boneyard, so to speak. And
well, unless you're ABC.
Really?
This is the whole other thing, right? Because for a long time, I remember in the late 90s, primetime, quote unquote. Yeah, primetime television was, TGIF, where you'd watch Boy Meets World and you'd watch Sister and Family Matters. And I remember as a younger kid being really excited for Friday nights because, of course, I was young. I wasn't like 16, 17. I was like 10, 11, 12 watching these TV shows. I didn't have anything to do on Friday nights. And that was the perfect slot for me to do something or watch TV. But that being said, for what I think the demographic for what they are aiming for with Firefly, 8 p.m. on Friday is probably not the right time. If you're aiming for like the 17 to 25 or maybe 17 to 35 demographic, you're really not hitting the mark because those folks are probably out doing something on Fridays.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, Fox, unsurprisingly, super fucked it up. If I remember this correctly, they actually aired several of the episodes out of order. I believe
Yeah.
they aired The Bank Job first, which was technically, I believe, episode 3. Don't quote me on this. And yeah, they aired a couple things out of order because the producers felt that they needed to kick things off with more of a bang and really just have a rip-roaring start, which I guess is fine depending upon who you're trying to bring in, I suppose. So yeah, I watched all of it then. Was pretty devastated when I heard it was canceled. And then, of course, the movie came along, and what was kind of unique about this era, this time, right? As I say it like it was like 1762. It was like 2004, 2005.
I mean, that was 15 years ago.
Right, exactly.
Like, that's crazy.
First off, I feel old. Second off, like, this was sort of at a point where, like, and it's not to say that shows that got canceled before Firefly didn't have dedicated fan bases that stuck around. Like, that's always been a thing, right? But I think certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, this idea of shows coming back, shows getting revived on different networks, shows getting revived on different media platforms, like, it's all possible now, right? And with Firefly, we were kind of at that point where, even though the show got canceled, you know, I was able to go out and buy 5 or 6 DVDs and harass people who hadn't actually seen it the first time and be like, hey, you know, this means a lot to me. Let's sit down for 17 hours and watch this show or whatever, which I think was something that really wasn't as possible before.
It's more like 10 hours, but that's fine.
That's close.
Yeah.
That's close enough. I mean, it's nearly double. My estimate was, so maybe not that close, but yeah. So that was kind of my experience. Since then, I've seen Serenity. Beyond that, my participation hasn't really gone beyond that. So
Gotcha. Well, to just briefly give my history with this, I didn't know about this show till I think my sophomore year of college. So 2007, 2008, some friends of mine were like, Mike, you've never heard of this show? And I was like, no, why would I? Never really watched TV. And that was true. I didn't really do a lot of TV watching. I watched more movies and stuff when I was in high school. But I ended up sitting down and watching the show, I think, in a weekend with my friends, and I was blown away by it. You know, like the ability to do like a network television style sci-fi show and have it feel so compelling. Like, I'd never seen anything like that before, and I'd never seen Buffy. I'd never seen anything else that Joss Whedon had worked on. And so I really loved it, and I was super bummed that it had been canceled because there's so much story to continue, so many open questions by the end of even the first season. And then, of course, I saw the movie, and, you know, seeing the end of the series, like, you know, people wanted it to come back and wanted it to get revived, but, you know, the cast and the crew and, you know, even writers, Joss Whedon and company, you know, they said, well, Serenity is the end of the story. Like, we've decided that that's the way that it's going to be done. Which is a bummer, but you know, I accepted it and moved on. And the fact that it still carries on to this day, people are still wanting, you know, Malcolm Reynolds style stuff. They still quote things. The Firefly class, you know, ship is still getting printed on T-shirts and posters, and people are still doing mashups, is a testament to how influential a single series was. And I think you can probably see that influence across the medium of comics and television, where you can do these character like study style shows where you've got, or group dynamic style shows where you've got a very rich cast of characters, and their interplay between each other. When you pair 2 or 3 of them, or you group 2 or 3 of them off together, you tell a totally different story than if another, you know, group of 3 were telling the same situation, because of how varying each of the characters are. But the fact that they all come together, you know, on this one ship under this one person. I mean, Firefly has this strong theme of like family and loyalty. And I think one thing, Kait, you didn't mention, kind of summing up the show, is that there is this backdrop of a former massive civil war that had happened among this coalition of planets, right? Where there were the Browncoats versus the Alliance, and the Browncoats, who are seemingly at least painted as the good guys, at least from the perspective of the characters in the story, they lost the war and they have to deal with being on the losing side of the war, even if they feel that they were, completely in the right, and their alliance or allegiance to this rebel group, quote unquote rebel group, is kind of like a black mark on them. And the fact that our two of the main characters, Zoe and Malcolm, are always wearing their brown coats around is kind of like it's like a faux pas in culture. And they know that if they show up in the wrong place with these colors on, they can end up in a lot of trouble just for being, even sympathizers to the browncoats. So it's a really interesting perspective to put all the entire crew and the majority of the cast in this underdog position where they're always in the chance of being hunted down. And I think it makes for really compelling television. The question is, does it make for really compelling comics? And that's kind of what we're here to discuss, even 15 minutes in of discussion. I'm curious to know, based off of the comics that we've all read, do you guys think that these comics worked? And we can talk about comparing the Boom stuff to the Dark Horse stuff in a minute. But what did you guys think of the comics overall? I guess I'll kick back to Nick, since you are the person that seems to have, you're kind of in the same boat as I am. I didn't really read anything up until this episode. So what were your thoughts on having seen the show and then reading these comics?
I think obviously the comics are both trying to do very different things and coming from very different places, I think. With the Dark Horse comic, you've certainly got this one that's deliberately trying to serve a very specific function, which is acting as sort of a bridge between the show and the film. And I think it does that very well. It certainly walks, talks, and feels like Firefly, I think. But again, I don't think it was trying to do anything wildly ambitious. I think it had a specific goal that it was trying to achieve, and it did that. I think the tricky thing, and again, this is like personal art aesthetic preferences getting rolled out here, but I felt obviously Conrad for Dark Horse was attempting to do realistic likenesses, which is always super tough. We've seen this quite a bit in modern years with different artists attempting to tackle this with Star Wars. So we've gotten kind of an interesting kind of a little amount of insight into that recently. And I think for me, because like the tricky thing about likenesses, right, is that you can be 90% right and it's still going to look off and it's still going to stand out and it's possibly still going to bug you. And I think for me, Conrad doesn't totally stick the landing. I've seen worse. Lord only knows I've seen worse. For me, there were definitely some character likenesses that were sort of off. And it's not that they were all consistently bad, but there were a few where I was like, I don't know. I feel like Zoe was good. Jane was passable, but Mal and Wash really felt off for me.
Well, I mean, but they still captured like maybe not the exact likeness of the actors, but they still captured the overall look, right? Mal is always in his brown coat, and when he's not, he's in suspenders and a white shirt. Wash is in Hawaiian shirts the entire time. Jane is always dressed up like a military action fighter. Like it works enough so that you don't get any of the characters
like
confused.
If you're saying that the wardrobe is properly done enough to provide context clues when the facial expressions and whatnot aren't totally on point, sure. Yeah, I'll give you that. That's fine.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
I really, really like Dan McDade as an artist. He drew the Boom stuff, and I liked his approach a lot more, which was that he totally went more for stylized. I'm just more of a fan of that, personally. I'm not sure what it is, if it's like a British artist thing, but like if you look at someone like Mark Lamming's artwork, Dan McDade's artwork, I think they're all British. They're all UK. Let's just say they're all UK, because I'm not certain they're all British. They're all UK artists, but like Mark Lamming, Dan McDade, Brian Bolland, like they all have this super heavy inks and shadows sort of shading. I don't know if it's like a school of art or something that they're all kind of learning over there or something, but like I noticed that a lot with McDade's work, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. I also felt the color palette of the Boom was much more deliberately in line with the show.
Agreed. I absolutely agree with that.
So, yeah.
Yeah, Kate, what did you think? I mean, you're a diehard fan. This is where I'm putting you and classifying you as. What were your thoughts going into a lot of these comics? I think you've read quite a bit more than Nick and I have.
Yeah, I've read almost all of them that have come out. There's a few things that I haven't gotten my hands on, but yeah, I think that the original Dark Horse run that started being released around the time of the movie, I agree that is a lot more realistic. They were trying to make the characters look like the actors, and I think that they did a pretty good job. I do agree that I had some trouble with recognizing Wash the first time I read this. I remember that. But after having watched the show in preparation for this and then gotten right into that run of the comics, I appreciated it. Like I recognized everybody. I thought that the art was really clean and color, like vibrantly colored. And then going to the Boom comics, those are more abstract, more stylized, which was really jarring after reading the Dark Horse stuff.
Yeah, I read them in that order too, and I felt the exact same way.
Yeah. And I mean, if I had just picked up this Boom run at a shop, I'm not super sure that I would have bought it, because I like that more realistic, clean look rather than a more abstract look. But it does work. Like once I got into the story, I did appreciate that things weren't quite as clean. Like it helped keep the action moving, I guess, for me, like it being a little bit more of a sketched look.
Mm-hmm.
And then the original run, the original Dark Horse run, I feel like that was more to bulk out the existing universe, like to fill in the empty parts in the timeline, or to answer questions that longtime fans have had. And then there was this really, I imagine that it would have been an awkward transition for anybody that hadn't watched the show and the movie both, because there's a huge gap in the timeline in the comics where the movie was at. So you go from volume 2, which, like, I mean, spoiler alert, in the movie, one of the main characters dies, and suddenly he's gone in volume 4. Like they talk about him not being around anymore. And if you hadn't watched the movie, it would be like, where did this guy go? Did he just like leave them? I don't even know if they mentioned that he died. They're just like, he's gone. Yeah. So that was a little bit awkward. But the Boom run kind of stands on its own 2 feet. Like, I don't think that it really needs to be considered as part of a larger universe. Obviously, it would help if you did. You'd get more of the backstory, like why there's some awkwardness between some of the characters. But I've read the first 3 volumes of it. It's called The Unification War, and it talks about, well, it covers the quote-unquote current timeline of Firefly that we see in the show before the movie, where like it's ongoing. It also falls within that timeline that we're familiar with, but the characters you see more of their memories of that civil war that is the background of this whole story, and it kind of influences current events more than it has before. So you kind of see like they're like almost PTSD type visions or memories, and then they have to deal with them. They talk about them a little bit more. But I've read the first 3 volumes of this, and it is an ongoing big plot line throughout all of these books. Like the characters get split up. You don't know, like the books end on cliffhangers. People aren't together. Like there's like, I know where the story has to end if they stay canon with the movie, because they all have to get back together for the movie. No one can die before that, but like, man, it's its own story.
Yeah, I was actually genuinely surprised that the first volume that Greg Pak had written ended with like a cliffhanger. It didn't even resolve as the end of the volume. I was genuinely surprised by that. But it seems like, the Unification War thing keeps going. I did feel like that they were hammering pretty damn hard on the whole you was in a war and you saw some bad shit. But I think that that's also like a continuation of like I had read a bunch of the old Dark Horse stuff first, and that kind of gets brought up every once in a while. That's a thing that's, you know, pervasive throughout the whole TV show, I think, as well as the comics, you know, that Mal and Zoe have some pretty bad shit in their past, and they are trying to get past it, and they're trying not to let it haunt them, and yet it keeps coming back. Which, you know, that's an interesting plot. I think that there is some good story there, but the fact that it felt very heavy handed in this first volume from Boom. I was kind of just like, all right, there are other things to do, right? The other characters in the story aren't necessarily just side characters. They actually have fully fledged story bits, which I thought was really interesting, that in comparison to the Dark Horse stuff that Joss Whedon had written, I think that he was able to give everybody the amount of screen time, like quote unquote, that they needed in order to allow them to spread their wings equally throughout the run. Even just in the 1 3-issue volume that we read. Because I had read the other stuff. I read like the Shepherd book one, or the Shepherd's Tale one shot. I read the Chris Samney one shot that he drew. And I really liked everything that I read in the Dark Horse stuff. It felt like natural continuations or little asides, like almost like a BPRD or a Hellboy like volume, where it's just like a little story inside the shared universe that doesn't necessarily connect to the other stories that are in this contained volume or in other volumes. So I think to that end, I actually really like the Dark Horse stuff more, but I think it's two different types of approaches, right? I think Boom is trying to say, okay, we only have so much timeline that we can potentially write stories in, because we know that if we're keeping the continuity the way that it is, that it has to eventually get back to the movie. And if it has to get back to the movie, then things dramatically change and we lose a main character. So we probably shouldn't try to avoid that. Instead, we need to make all these stories last a little bit longer. So, you know, rather than them just wrapping up individual arcs, 6 issues at a time, I feel like the thing for them to do is to drag them out a little bit. It sounds to me like it's enjoyable, Kate, but having only read the first volume, it felt like, oh, this is just going to keep going. This one mission, or quote, in my mind, this one episode is just going to take a little bit longer than in previous runs of this series.
Yeah, I felt like the original Dark Horse run was just like individual capers, basically. Like every volume kind of stands on its own. It could be its own episode, maybe a long episode, but
sure.
And then this new one is just its own series, basically, just in it by itself.
Yeah.
I do think that you're right about the original Dark Horse run does a better job of making all of the other characters other than Mal and Zoe like standalone. Like they are still individual characters. They still have their individual stories, and you see those stories, versus the current Boom run. You still see them in the background. Occasionally they do still get kind of split up and they have to take care of things, but it's really focused on Mal and Zoe. Because even when the party is split, like in D&D, never split the party. It's still like Zoe is still basically running one part of the story, and Mal is still basically running the other part of the story. But we do also get new characters, which you don't really see in their Dark Horse run. We're just working with the established characters on that one, which is still great. I mean, you still get filled in different parts of the TV show that you never really found out, like the end of like a side story or something, or you wanted to learn more about somebody. And that's great. That's cool. I loved that. But it is really nice to have some fresh faces that these new creators can just work with and give them their own story. And it's fine if they die, because that adds it's fine within canon that they die. And then while you're reading the comic book, it adds a level of unknown.
Yeah, you don't know if someone's just going to either die or they're going to go off somewhere else in space. I mean, it's the same thing that I think a lot of other licensed books have a problem with. I think the one that we're going to keep coming back to is Star Wars, because I think it's the most prevalent. But Star Wars has that same thing where they can introduce plenty of characters, but it's a matter of they need to either be completely gone or dead before, the timeline syncs up with the rest of the movies, right? I think this is the thing that, Jason Aaron probably struggles with when he was working on the stuff that took place between New Hope and Empire Strikes Back is like, okay, we've got, 12 or 15 volumes that we can write here, but we need to make sure that it all wraps up nicely so that the characters end up where they need to be before Empire starts. But yeah, I don't know if that's the continuity with Firefly. I don't think is nearly as obsessed with as something like Star Wars. But it does make sense. They eventually have to get to that point, assuming that Boom is going to keep this the storyline the same.
Yeah,
but
yeah, I do feel like either one of these series would be a lot for somebody to get into that hasn't seen the show or isn't already invested in it, because Unification War, the Boom series, it just picks up and it goes at full force, like full speed ahead. It's very action heavy, and it ends in a cliffhanger, so you're gonna want the next one ready, and that just keeps going. Like it just keeps going like that. And then the Better Days, the Dark Horse volume. It's great. I don't know how well it would stand alone to somebody who isn't familiar with the franchise already. I'd be really interested to hear from somebody who picked this book up without being familiar with the rest of the story.
Yeah, I think that Dark Horse volume has a heavily reliance on you have seen the movie or you've seen the TV show. Now you can read this. Whereas I think Greg Pak in his run at Boom, he tries really hard in the first issue to like establish all the characters' relationships, really ham-fisted, and like to the point where like people are like, Mel, you really need to tell Inara how you feel about her, and like it's clear that Zoe and Wash are married, and like the Doctor and River have some weird mystery thing going on, and River's kind of zany and Jane is gruff, and like they establish everyone really quickly with like just these very in your face definitions of the characters, which I took to be a little jarring, but I guess if you haven't read anything from Firefly before, maybe you need that. Nick, I don't know if you had that same feeling when you were reading the Boom series.
I mean, yeah, there was a lot of stuff about the war. That's true. But I did like how they handled it. I think that typically with a lot of flashbacks and a lot of other books, or just typical flashback techniques within comics, or like sepia tone, or maybe things are a little bit faded or subdued. It's like the typical like diddle 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 thing, that you have on TV.
Yeah.
And I think that the Boom book really captured well what you got a little bit of in the show, not a lot, because obviously Firefly didn't have a massive budget, although it was still massive enough that it's part of why it got killed. But like you didn't have these huge war scenes, but you had these, snippets here and there that were these like, all of a sudden out of nowhere, like this rough snap cut to like this war scene, and it was jarring and it was bright and it was terrifying. I felt like the Boom books really captured that like sudden snapped, like a war flashback, where it's like it's not peaceful, it's not sepia tone, right? It's like vibrantly like yellow and red backdrops, and it's terrifying and it's sudden, and I thought that was done really well, to be honest. I will say this though, and Boom, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like if you guys need like some like consultant work on your editing, just let me know, because the credits for your book say that it includes Firefly 1-3 and Firefly Bad Company #1, when in fact I'm pretty sure that your book is Firefly 1-4, because the Bad Company issue is about Saffron, and I did not read anything about her during the course of the volume.
Yeah, same.
So yep.
So get at us.
Yep.
I guess I don't know. We could probably talk back and forth about these books for a while, but I mean, my real final thoughts about this book are, unless there was anything else you guys wanted to get to, but my final thoughts is that Firefly to me is like a really fun episodic, in my opinion, response to Star Trek that adds like a dash of harsh reality into the idea of space exploration, kind of removing all the notion of advancement in exchange for like a disproportionate representation of tech growth and culture separation as shown by like the Wild West feel of everything. Like as I don't know, maybe Whedon was trying to get at this commentary of like society kind of breaks down due to rapid expansion that resulted in this Western style society of people just trying to limp by with little money, but with this advanced tech that requires a lot of advanced understanding and price. I don't know if that was what he was going for, but that's kind of the way that I've always taken Firefly, as like we expanded too much and like wealth distribution doesn't come along with advanced expansion. And so you end up with people who are like, you know, Mal's family, who are ranchers because they're sent to a planet to say, all right, grow a bunch of animals, grow a bunch of, you know, plants and stuff like that we can harvest, because this is going to be a harvest planet that's going to send you know, things off to the bigger cities and everything. Kind of like, you know, if we think of it like an American sense, you know, you have areas in the country that are just farmland, and there's just miles and miles of grazing land for animals, or in a lot of cases, miles of warehouses where animals live, to, you know, feed the rest of the country. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people all end up in like these happy advanced happy advanced lives where they have all this nice tech and they have the ability to live as well as people that live in like the core planets. So I really have always appreciated that about Firefly, that it's like people have to still survive in this advanced tech world, but maybe they aren't themselves culturally as advanced as some other people. And I don't mean that as like in a derogatory term, but like, or in a derogatory way, but it is interesting to see that people still fall back on these ideas that I think are prevalent in like a Western society of bartering and robbing and all this other stuff. And it helps that I think Whedon and co, you know, they took this idea of, well, they would have a lot of horses. They would have, you know, they would have like wagons and stuff like that for transport, because it's all easy. It's all simple machines. We don't have to invest in bringing fuel and stuff if all we need is animals. Therefore, we kind of fall back on this idea of having, you know, a jet engine ship, but also there are horses. So I've always appreciated that clash between Western and sci-fi in a way that feels like a way that something that you could explain away in an interesting way without it being like forced upon the viewer and the reader in this case. But I don't know. Do you guys have any final thoughts about Firefly? Because I just wanted to get on my soapbox really quick.
My final thoughts are not nearly, they don't sound nearly as nice as as your analysis, which was very good. I guess if you are just a casual Firefly fan and you're not sure that you want to get super into the comics because there are so many of them, I do recommend the Free Comic Book Day 2016 comic. It's a short, just a single issue. It's called The Warrior in the Wind, and it's basically River is babysitting, and she tells the story of the very general story of the Firefly crew through the movie very quickly, but in like these really fantastical, almost like Robin Hood type terms. And it's just a delightful little story that hopefully you can still find for free somewhere.
Very cool. Very cool. What about you, Nick? Any last thoughts on Firefly? You're going to pick up all the books now?
You know, if anything else, I think I might at least continue the Boom series. I think what's really interesting, and I kind of touched on it maybe a little bit, but you know, sometimes when you have a franchise property get shifted between publishers or things like that, not only is it not a super like peaceful or amicable one, but frequently you end up in situations where things end up going out of print, right? Or it just becomes harder to get your hands on things.
Right.
And I do think what was really unique and interesting about this handover was that not only did Boom get Whedon on board as a consultant, which maybe that means that he gets his name on a check every month and maybe that's it. But that aside, they got the rights to actually republish all of the Dark Horse content, which was kind of a win-win. But what became even more interesting is that they actually retained the Dark Horse books as canon. And I found that really fascinating because frequently that is exactly the opposite of what you see, right?
Right,
Normally
right.
you're like, all right, you had your fun, and we had this with Dark Horse handing we had it with Dark Horse handing over another franchise called Star Wars when they gave it back to Marvel, and Marvel went, all right, you had your fun, pretty much everything you did was all a fever dream, it never happened, cool.
Except for when we want to pick and choose little bits and pieces that we want to keep.
Exactly. And so I do find it really fascinating that you can kind of juxtapose that with this, where Boom said everything that happened with Dark Horse is canon. Like, all of that took place, and we're just going to build around what you built. I don't know. I found that really interesting. Obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy, but in terms of like the dumb little parts of comics that I find kind of fascinating, I did find that really interesting, because I know you and I have had a ton of discussions about kind of the tricky nature of sort of what you got at earlier, which is, you know, you've got comics that you need to write, and you have, you know, an allotment of 2 or 3 arcs, but by the end of the 3rd arc, you know, character X, Y, and Z, you know, they can't be dead and they need to be on this planet, because that's when the movie takes place. And so I did find that really interesting, that Boom, in some ways, willingly and effectively made things a lot harder for themselves, which I found that very fascinating. And I do wonder, and I think Kait got at this, and I haven't read enough to know that this is true, but Dark Horse basically was telling stories on both ends, right? So they were telling stuff leading up to, you know, preceding the show, following the show, preceding the movie, following the movie. And it seems like Boom is, as far as I've read, like, what, preceding the show, right? And that's the only sort of...
It could be. I've been interpreting it as taking place between the end of the show and the beginning of the movie, but it could be...
Yeah. Well, because River and the Doctor are on board.
Oh,
so it
yes.
has to be,
Yes. That's, I was going to say that takes the guesswork right out of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
But
so I'm really interested to see if Boom, given that they've made all of the Dark Horse stuff canon, I'm very curious to see if Boom tries to go and try to tell stories following the content that Dark Horse did. So I don't know. I think this is an interesting kind of... This is the part of comics I always find kind of fascinating, because it's like, how do you put the puzzle, how do you break the puzzle apart and put it back together, you know? So,
yeah, well, Kait, thanks for bringing this to the table for us to talk about. I think that, I mean, this is Firefly is a weird thing, because I never thought that I had so much like love and care for it until I started reading these comics, and I didn't need to be reminded of anything. Like, so much of that story is still like very heavily embedded in my brain. I knew all the characters, I knew their names, I knew what their personalities were like. So as I was reading it, I can tell when things were right and when things were wrong. And for the most part, everything felt really right. So I was very pleased with everything that we read. So thanks for bringing this to the table again.
Yeah.
Anyways, you know, you can follow us all on the internet. You can follow Kait at Kait Elfear. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow me at Mike Rappin. These are all on Twitter. You can follow the show on Instagram and Twitter at IRCB Podcast, where I try to post things pretty regularly, sometimes previews of episodes and so on and so forth.
This show and our many subscriber-only episodes are powered by fans like you on Patreon. You can join now at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. And if you haven't already, please rate and review our show. 5 stars would be great on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Join us on Discord at ircbpodcast.com/Discord, and make sure to tell a friend or two about the show.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. Xander is a really cool guy, just a fun person to talk to. He's just great at presentations, and he does the editing for the show. Thank you so much, Xander. And thank you to Nick and Kait for all the hard work you guys put in for this episode, and as always, and for being on the episode. And thank you to all the fans out there who listen and have hung out with us on Discord. It's been really fun doing our book club on Discord. I've been really enjoying that. So until next time, keep safe, wash your hands, comics are good, and so are you.